Decades before the multitude of classes and backgrounds in Dungeons and Dragons, there were the Alchemist, Detective, and Artificer. These unique classes from White Dwarf magazine offer a fascinating glimpse at the earliest days of our hobby. Join me as I explore the origins, mechanics, and impact of these classes on D&D today on Daddy Roll the One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons. It's also going to be part of my sub-history list on D&D class history, as we're going to be talking about 3 classes that were developed in White Dwarf magazine, which was at the time in the late 70s, early 80s, sort of the British equivalent from Games Workshop of Dragon magazine here in the United States. Over time, White Dwarf is going to end up becoming a house organ that solely focuses just on Games Workshop games, primarily Warhammer 40K. But at its inception, it was very much similar to Dragon in that it was covering a lot of fantasy and science fiction gaming and miniatures, and including Dungeons and Dragons during that time, and it specifically advanced Dungeons and Dragons, which was, again, at the time, the most popular role-playing game out there. So before we get started to dig into these 3 classes that we're going to be talking about, I do want to talk a little bit about the history of White Dwarf and how it came to be and its connection to Dungeons and Dragons. Now, interestingly enough, I have covered a little bit of this before in my video on the Fiend Folio, the first edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Fiend Folio, and how that book came to be and its direct relationship to Games Workshop. But I realized that that video was actually made, which is crazy to me, about a year and a half ago. So just, it's hard for me to believe that it has been that long since I've been doing these videos, but I thought it would be helpful for people who haven't gone back through the back catalog of all my videos to maybe just quickly revisit that history. And speaking of history, if that is something that you enjoy, learning this kind of detailed information about the foundations and the history of our hobby and how we got to the game of Dungeons and Dragons, then I would please request that you like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit the bell icon so you'll be notified when I upload new videos like this one. All right, so let's jump in and talk about the foundations of White Dwarf and where that came from. And to do that, we need to go all the way back to 1969. So 5 years before Dungeons and Dragons is even going to be published, and look at a zine or a newsletter called Albion, which was specifically created for the game of diplomacy. And it was mostly written and published by Don Turnbull. And Don is going to become important to the history of TSR UK's division and directly responsible for the creation of the Fiend Folio book that I mentioned earlier. But right now we're talking about Albion. So that publication is going to run for 5 years, from 1969 through 1974, I think it is. It might be 1975. And it is 1975. And after the magazine wraps up and finishes publishing, 2 of its readers, who were Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson. And I mentioned this last time, but it's very important to remember, in the tabletop role-playing game community, there are 2 people named Steve Jackson. One is American, from Steve Jackson Games, originally from Metagaming here in the United States. And the other is the Steve Jackson that's connected with Games Workshop in the UK. And when I grew up, I thought it was the same person. I didn't know, because what are the chances that there are 2 people named Steve Jackson in such a niche hobby? But there are. And so we're talking about the Steve Jackson from the UK. And so he and Ian Livingstone approached Don Turnbull and asked if they could purchase his mailing list and use it for a little zine that they were putting out called Owl and Weasel. This is a quick look at Albion and how it would have appeared when it was put out. This is just the 30th issue. It's just one that I grabbed online to kind of look at. So Alan Weasel is going to come out, and it's published. I think there are a total of 6 issues. It's very, very quick, but this was the precursor to White Dwarf. So Ian and Steve approach Don and ask for his mailing list so that he starts selling people who were subscribing to Albion copies of Alan Weasel to replace, because Albion had ceased to be published. So this is going to be published between 1975 and 1977. And you see this one, it's only 4 pages. So this is the first page, and you see it was just folded. It was on giant sheets of paper and then folded in half to create, I'm assuming 8.5 by 11, although this could be, a smaller size. I'm not 100% sure. But one of the people who had subscribed to Albion was none other than Brian Bloom, who was one of the people that helped found Tactical Studies Rules. He put money in after Gary Gygax and his partner and friend Don Kay didn't quite have enough money to publish the games they want to play. I've covered most of this before, but again, this is a refresher for folks, or it's new to you if you're new to the channel or just haven't gone through the back catalog yet. But Brian Bloom is the third person that's brought in. He was a gaming, we'll call him a friend is probably a strong word. He was a gaming acquaintance of Gary's, and I think they were friends for a while. But Brian Bloom brings in the other part of the money that is needed to help eventually publish Dungeons and Dragons. So Brian Bloom is a reader of Owl and Weasel because he had been a reader of Albion, and he contacts the folks at Games Workshop, who were the publishers of Owl and Weasel, and they start conversations to the point where TSR then works with the folks at Games Workshop to become the official distributors and publishers of Dungeons and Dragons games in England and the UK. And they even go so far as to do things like create their own covers. So they start printing Dungeons and Dragons books in the UK through Games Workshop because that was cheaper than printing them here in the United States and then shipping them over there. So that relationship lasts for a while, but not that long. So maybe a few years, and then eventually TSR is going to create its own UK division, and Games Workshop's going to lean in really heavily into the other games that they were talking about, including Call of Cthulhu and Traveller and things like that, until eventually they start publishing their own games, at which point they begin pushing those very, very quickly. So the first one being Warhammer Fantasy Battle, and then Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and of course, like I already mentioned, Warhammer 40K. So that's the super quick version of how this came to be. But one of the things that is important is that when White Dwarf is eventually going to take over for Alan Weasel, and they did that mostly because they were trying to copy what was happening in the United States with the Strategic Review, which I've spoken about before, and how that it's more than a newsletter, but it was pretty sparse. But eventually the strategic Review is going to be split into 2 different publications, Little Wars and Dragon. And Dragon was much more of a professional looking publication. And so the folks at Games Workshop were trying to copy that model by changing Owl and Weasel from its sort of amateurish publication and distribution and make it a little bit more professional, and that's where they create White Dwarf. Okay, so that's how we get to the part that we're going to talk about now, which is these 3 classes in White Dwarf. So this is going to be a little bit of a quicker video than some of my other ones, which doesn't mean it's going to be short by any means. If this is not going to be obviously a 12-minute video. But it'll be shorter than some of my 90-minute ones. But I wanted to talk about these 3 classes specifically because of the type of environment or the type of aesthetic that they evoke, which is a little bit beyond. It's pushing the boundaries of that traditional fantasy, whether it's either high fantasy or low fantasy, and really the technology level, and kind of pushing a little bit forward, because I think it's fun to sort of maybe get out of a rut once in a while and look at different genres, different eras of role-playing. Now, I'm also a big fan of the idea that if you are trying to emulate a certain genre that maybe is a little bit more in the modern era, sometimes it's better to look for a game that was specifically designed to create those mechanics and to do them in a specific way, versus the alternative, which is trying to shoehorn D&D into that and create things that it wasn't necessarily created to do originally. In this case, I think it's okay because it's very, very light on the idea, and you don't really have to go full bore technology with any of these 3 classes. You don't have to use firearms with them or anything like that. But it's the idea really more of like the role in society, like how would these types of classes end up being an occupation that someone would want to take. And that does start to create a little bit of a nuance of the kind of setting that you want to evoke. And there are a lot of resources out there that you can use to try to help do that. And I'll talk about some of those as we go through this. But the first one that I want to talk about is going to be in White Dwarf issue number 20. Okay, so White Dwarf number 20, issue 20. This is from August, September 1980. And I'm not going to go through the whole issue, but I just wanted to talk about the cover since that's where we're starting here. So this cover is by an artist named Angus McKie or Mackay. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it. It's McKie. And he is a famous, very famous British comics creator, illustrator, one of the first people to work with computer-generated art. And he worked with a variety of different people, did a lot of science fiction covers for different magazines and books, but also worked in the comics fields. And one of the things I picked up on that I saw was that he worked with Dave Gibbons. And if you're familiar with the very seminal comic book Watchmen from 1985, I believe it was, 85, 86, Dave Gibbons was the artist for that. And I was actually lucky enough to get to meet Dave Gibbons at Long Beach Comic Con a few years ago. And I had him sign my copy of Watchmen #1 that I picked up way back in the day, as well as my first printing of the trade collection of all of Watchmen. So that was a cool experience. But Angus McKie worked with Dave Gibbons on a few different projects. So that's the cover. It's this science fiction cover, and that's very indicative of White Dwarf. They were much more likely to kind of lean into the science fiction aspects of the hobby a little bit more than Dragon. Dragon, and Dragon does have some science fiction covers, don't get me wrong, but when you look at the totality of the covers of the magazine and on a percentage basis, there's a higher percentage of science fiction covers on White Dwarf than there are in Dragon magazine. Okay, so the class that we want to talk about here is going to be this one, the Alchemist. It says character conjuring. This issue, our new regular feature, expands upon an existing non-player character class. So that part right there, that it's a non-player character class, is a little bit disappointing because this is sort of like not completely expanded or developed to be a full class. It is very much firmly in the idea that this is a class that you would hire from the list of specialist types that you would hire from the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide that came out in 1979. But I still think that there's some stuff here. I just wish it had been expanded a little bit more. Now, this is written by Tony Chamberlain, you see here. And from what I can find as far as like future contributions to the hobby, Tony does write a few articles in White Dwarf, but I mean, maybe not even a few, as there were a couple. I think in this one, issue number 25, and then there was like maybe a collection or something where one of his articles was picked up. But for the most part, it seems to be limited to just that. I'm going to expand the text on this a little bit just to make it easier for me to read. Also should hopefully make it easier for you. But the idea is that it says the Alchemist is probably the most powerful and interesting of the non-player hireling characters used in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, with the innate ability of producing magical items under the guidance of a magic user. And that's, again, really where this class, as developed here, kind of has its core. Now, I do think that there are ideas here that could be expanded upon to kind of make this into a full class for AD&D. It's really sort of presented as sort of like a magic user light almost, which is unfortunate because I think there was probably some opportunities here to create some fun and unique abilities that were specific to alchemy. And there are a few in here, but I think it could have been expanded some more. So it talks about this belief that it's alchemy, the universe is a unity and founded on the existence of first matter. Alchemists believe the characteristics of an object can be stripped away to reduce it to first matter, to which other characteristics can be added. And then it talks about the four elements, fire, air, water, and earth are the initial development of first matter, and the difference between, just scrolling up here, sorry, the difference between materials is caused by the differing proportions in which the four elements are combined in them. So it goes on and on. I really like these kind of unique little symbols that they use here. It's probably supposed to represent some kind of alchemy written language. Now, I have talked about a Dragon magazine version of the Alchemist that was published before, so it's kind of fun to compare this to those. So you'll want to go back and check out those videos. I'll put a link to them up here, upper right hand corner. So it says that they can be human, half elf, or half orc, and that they combine certain skills of clerics and magic users. So I thought the cleric thing was kind of interesting because that's not normally something you would associate with an alchemist, but it says that they have to remain absolutely neutral, just like a druid. So not even law or chaos, just pure neutral. And then they are, they really focus on intelligence and dexterity versus the martial arts, which totally makes sense. And they can only go up to level 6. So that was the part that, again, unless you wanted to play in a lower level campaign where some people top out at like level 5, then that's fine. But for the most part, I think you'd want to expand this beyond that, obviously. But you die roll to figure out what level this person is that you're trying to hire. And then it says they can perform simple services for a fee. And then if not otherwise engaged, it says more likely they'll enter into contract with a magic user or cleric for a number of years at a rate of 300 GP per month minimum. And then it gets into the spell casting, the spells that they can cast. So you see here at the different levels. So it's like protection spells, detection spells, pyrotechnics, detect good and evil, no alignment, slow poison, stinking cloud. So most of these, I guess, are things that you would associate with alchemy, but some of them, like legend lore, I'm not really sure how that kind of fits in. Stone to flesh totally makes sense. Slow poison, conjure elemental, it does make sense. Transmute rock to mud, obviously. But that's it. And so in order to learn a spell, you have to be at that level. So level 6 alchemist is the only one that can cast these 2 spells here. So the spell list is extremely limited. And then it gives you the prices of how much they would charge people to cast those different spells that they can. And then it talks about magic items, and they have to have a well-equipped laboratory is essential for the production of magical items, including potions and all the raw materials. Some cool art here. And then let's scooch over here. And it talks about how the alchemist can cast and therefore charge fees for certain spells in the course of fabricating a magical item. A magic user or cleric of sufficiently high level of ability must supervise the operation, so they can't kind of do it on their own. And it gives you the costs here of things that you would need. So, different kinds of furnaces and glasses, alembics, crucibles, bellows, all this kind of stuff, mortar and pestle, how much that costs and how many you would need in order to make these different magic items. And then it gets into laboratory explosions, which I really dig. So I love stuff like this. So it's like that creativity and the volatility of failure of what's going to happen and knowing when you go into it. And it's something I actually like to have for even regular spell casting. I know a lot of people don't like that, but I kind of like the idea that casting magic is dangerous. And so the same thing here with alchemy. So it says a hazardous profession and explosions are common. And then every month, alchemists must save versus spells. So it's just automatic. Once a month, you save versus spells. And if you fail, then an explosion happens and you determine the severity of the explosion by rolling percentile dice. So a 1 to 40 is negligible, 41 to 60 small, etc. And then if you rolled 100%, it's catastrophic. And so then each item in the laboratory, once that explosion has happened, has to make a save. As though they were hit by a fireball. And then any spells that is in progress when the explosion occurs would be spoiled. And it says persons in the laboratory have to save versus breath, weapon, or suffer damage from the explosions. And persons failing to save suffer D4 points of damage per level of explosion magnitude, such as it says a large explosion, which is the 4th largest, they would take 44 points of damage. So that's going to be it. That's the entire class that's presented in this book. So again, not book, in this magazine article. Again, it's intended for NPCs. Not a lot of detail there, but this is one of, it's not the first, but it's one of the first kind of alchemist classes that you see in writing for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. So again, you had some in Dragon Magazine, but the first one in Dragon, I believe, was still for OD&D. They are going to have later ones for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons that are much more detailed and complicated than this one. And I think that is sort of the trick with these types of classes, especially with something like this, where you're trying to balance the fiddliness of all these different things that they can do with playability. I think this one's a little too light, but I think that there's room for, not making it so detailed that you have to read 8 pages of descriptions to figure out what can be done. Okay, so that's the Alchemist. You also have Alchemists appearing in things like The Complete Alchemist, which was published by, I think it was Bard Games. I actually have that book. And as a coincidence, or not even a coincidence, it was intended, I had created an Alchemist class for my Old School Essentials book, Alchemy, Explosions, and Inventions. And I'm going to have some news about that, and I'm actually going to show some of the material at the end of the video, so make sure that you stay tuned for that. All right, and then that's going to wrap up the Alchemist. So next on, we're going to jump to White Dwarf number 24. And here we are with White Dwarf issue number 24. This is the April-May issue from 1981. Once again, just a brief discussion of this cover, which I love. I really dig the colors on this. It's muted, but I almost get a sort of a post-apocalyptic vibe from this, even though you see these kind of creatures flying in the background that look like some kind of pterodactyl or something. So, but I think it's a really cool, very striking cover. And we're going to dive into this one to talk about probably my favorite of the 3 different White Dwarf classes that we're going to talk about today. And that is going to be this one, Detectives. So this is the Detective class. And it's kind of interesting when you learn a little bit more about the person who developed this class. That's Marcus L. Rowland. And Marcus is going to be, of the 3 authors that we're going to talk about today, of the 3 different classes, Marcus is the one that really had a very prolific career in fantasy and science fiction that goes beyond just gaming. So also wrote a bunch of short stories and things like that. But so this is going to be actually Marcus's first thing that he ever wrote that was ever published, which was in White Dwarf number 24, this Detectives class. And then that is going to end up kind of spurring a career for him. So he's going to work on a variety of different games, not just Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. He's going to write stuff for Traveler, for Call of Cthulhu, for the Judge Dredd role-playing game. And then he goes beyond just writing articles, and eventually he's going to start creating like full adventures. So, or modules, whatever you want to call them. So specifically, or not just specifically, but especially for Call of Cthulhu. So he did the Great Old Ones adventure for Call of Cthulhu. He wrote stuff for Space 1889. And that's going to be relevant because his career in role-playing game writing is going to kind of end up going into the direction of being focused on sort of Victorian era or Edwardian era adventures and the aesthetic of those eras. And so I always thought it was kind of interesting when you see that the Detectives was the first article that he wrote, he's kind of getting closer to that time period of when these types of characters might be around. So eventually he's going to self-publish his own game called Forgotten Futures, the role-playing game of scientific romance, which is, again, it's a science fantasy game, but based on the aesthetics of what the Victorians and the Edwardians thought the future was going to be like. So from that standpoint. Now, one of the interesting things that he's going to do when he publishes that game is he is going to release it as shareware. So he releases it on floppy disks for people who want that so that they can download it and read it for themselves. And, there were things where I think he had hard copies available if you wanted to order them eventually from his website. And there was other ways that he was sharing that information. But he was one of the first people, if not the first, to do that within the role-playing game community. So it's, again, a really interesting point in time when you're seeing things that, again, we probably take for granted now, like distributing PDFs or putting up blogs and websites with information on them. But he was one of the first people to do that and approach the role-playing games from that standpoint. So again, I talked about he also did short stories, and he has a really interesting kind of fun role-playing game called Diana, Warrior Princess. And the way that I heard it described, I've never actually seen the game, but it does sound really, really interesting, is that it's talking about the late 20th century or early 21st century and sort of the mythology and these larger than life characters that are around, like real people, but how it might be viewed in the future, the same way that we in the 80s and 90s took the Xena warrior princess, and that was like a way to tell stories about ancient Greek mythology, which is and it's completely not accurate at all to even to the original stories. So I know it's a convoluted way of explaining it, but once I read that, I thought, hey, that sounds kind of like a lot of fun. So the idea is that it's people in the future looking back on how they might tell stories about this. So the Diana Warrior Princess, it's Prince Di, and she wears like leathers and rides around on like an intelligent motorcycle that she can talk to. And like there's a Tony Blair character in there, and there's a Margaret Thatcher character, and it sounds like could be a lot of fun. Maybe not for an extended campaign, but for like a one shot or something. I think that could be a lot of fun. So again, very prolific, and it's fun to see that this was his first entry into the role-playing game writing community. So again, I'm going to just increase the size here a little bit and look at this detective class. And it says it's a new class whose functions are the solving of mysteries and the restoration of law. So detectives may be human, half-elven, or elven, and they have to be lawful neutral. They can't be anything else. And then it says since their spells are quasi-clerical in origin, any change in alignment may result in their loss. And they can't be multi-classed. And it says they're sort of a combination of thieves and assassins. There's a little bit of rangers in here as well, as we're going to see. And then again, he mentions that the spells used are quasi-clerical and restored by the passage of time. They fight as thieves, and they can use any weapon except spears, lances, oil, and poison. And they can use any leather or light chain armor and small shields. And they have some different thief abilities. And then it gives you the minimum prime requisites. And then he lists them. He's using prime requisites incorrectly here. So I think what he means is the minimum attributes, because you don't have 6 prime requisites. The prime requisite is your prime one, which is the one that you need. But he lists that you need a minimum strength of 14, intelligence 14, wisdom 10, constitution 10, dexterity 12, and charisma 7, which is interesting. I think a detective might do better off having higher charisma so that he can talk to people, he or she can talk to people, and they can get the information that they need. And a 7 charisma to me would be something that's a little bit more gruff and maybe not able to do that, but whatever. It says that they can use the magical items available or usable by thieves, plus they can use magic chainmail and shield. And then you get these really fun level titles, of course. So this is a first edition advanced D&D. This is going to be the last edition that has level titles. But you've got Snoop, Ferret, Bloodhound, Seamus, Gumshoe, Eye, Dick, Sleuth, Investigator, Judge, and then Detective Class 2 through 8, and then Master Detective and Great Detective. So he takes it all the way up through level 20, and they start getting spells at 4th level, and their spells go up to 4th level in the power of the spell. They have to acquire a headquarters at a certain point in a large town, and then advertise that their services are for hire. And at 10th level, they attract 1 to 6 loyal followers. And by 12th level, their constant search for information gives them the accumulation of knowledge similar to that of a sage. And then it tells you how to use the sage tables and the first edition Advanced Dungeons & Dragons Dungeon Master's Guide to figure out what topics they might know. And so it said it could be, it will be general knowledge of a broad area such as botany, and then special knowledge of a topic within that area, such as orchid. And then again, it says refer to the DM's guide for the full list of topics. And then it gives you your thief and assassin skills and then tells you what percentages they are. And it just tells you it's like as thief, less 10% or less 15% or less 5% or whatever. And then the disguise skill is as an assassin, less 10%. So they're combination of thief and assassin, but their skills are not as good as those two classes. And then to balance that, it's because they have these spells. They can also track as rangers, but underground and in urban environments, they have to have observed the quarry within one turn of commencing tracking. And while outdoors, the base chance is only 50%, minus 10% for each 12 hours that have elapsed before the start of tracking, and minus 35% for each intervening hour of rain, etc. Okay, so it goes through all of that, and it says there can only be one great detective in a city, and if another enters, the two will either engage in non-lethal combat, with the loser being downgraded to master detective. I don't really like that. I don't think it makes sense at all that you would fight to see who's going to be the best detective in town. Or enter into an agreement where one specializes in consultancy work and never leaves his home while the other undertakes only active cases. That one maybe makes a little bit more sense, like an elder statesman who, again, is consulting but doesn't go on adventures anymore. And then it gives you your spells. So it's the stuff that you would kind of think of: comprehend languages, detect good and evil, detect lie, detect secret doors, detect undead. You have grade metals, which is interesting. So there's a lot of new spells in here, and they're kind of based on existing spells, but it's fun to have new spells in here. And I don't think any of them are necessarily outside the realm of things that you could add to a standard game, even if you don't want to use this class. Detect chaos, detect evasions. So that's kind of a supplement or complement to detect lie, but the detect lie spell only detects the actual lie, but it won't let you know if someone's being evasive and like holding back. Detect evasions will let you know that they're doing that. Detecting specific metals, escapology. This is a goofy name, but basically you can escape, binds and things like that. Read codes, reflect the past is an interesting spell. It's a little cumbersome and probably one that I wouldn't use. Requires a mirror to have been picked up something that happened, and then the detective can use that mirror to kind of look back and see what happened. Speak with animals, detect invisibility, and then you have detect metals and kind, escapology 2, know alignment, locate object, read hidden message, speak with plants, truth, visions of the past, which is an upgraded version of reflect the past, blink, escapology 3. So just like different things that you can get out of. So at this level, the material component is a metal fetter, which must be welded, riveted, and hammered closed, and then forced open by the detective by non-magical means. And then you use that against your flesh until it's used for the spell, and a new fetter must then be prepared before the spell can be cast again. But it allows you to break welded and riveted chains. Then you've got feigned death, improved metal detection, improved vision of the past, polymorph self, and then ungag. So those are your level 4 spells, and water breathing. And then that's it. That's the class. So it's nothing really necessarily, groundbreaking by any means, but I think really it's more about the idea of having a detective in a fantasy setting. And I think that that's a really fun idea to explore. And I'm actually going to go into that a little bit next and talk about some adventure types or adventure seeds that might inspire you to include a detective in your games. So if you're looking for some inspiration for how you might use a detective in a Dungeons and Dragons fantasy game, I highly recommend checking out a comic book by Image Publishing called Fair Lady. So this is written by Brian Shermer and had art done by Claudia Balboni. She did the pencils and the inks, and then Marissa Louise did the colors. And I actually reviewed this for a site called comicattack.net a few years ago. It came out in 2019, and I used to be a journalist for them. I technically still am. It's just been a while since I've written a review for them. But this comic book is so much fun. It's a fantasy comic, and the premise is that it's post-war. It's a post-war world in a society that is a fantasy society. And what's happening is all these soldiers that were drummed up to serve in the war have now been released from service, and they're looking for how they're going to make their way through the world. And so, as you can imagine, a lot of them don't necessarily go into the nicest types of careers that could happen. And so it deals with those repercussions of them needing to, seeking to find their place in the world. And one of these soldiers is this woman, Jenner Falds, and she disguised herself as a man to serve in the army. And now that she's out of service, she's trying to figure out, again, a way to make a living. And she decides to become what's called a fair man. But in her case, they call her a fair lady, and she's the only fair lady in the entire land. But they are essentially detectives, and they're licensed investigators, which is a new role that's been developed by the former soldiers in this post-war society. So she set herself up as like private security for this kind of eccentric wizard who lives in a tower. But then on the side, she also does investigator cases that like nobody else will take. And she gets those cases because, again, a lot of people won't hire her because she's the only woman doing this job. And so she gets the cases that like nobody else will take. And she's got this person that hangs out with her, this cat person who's like her muscle that she uses to sort of like, force people to talk and like scare them, like intimidate them. And it's really funny, their relationship. And I really like the story. The world building is really, really interesting. The land that they live on, it's sort of like when you get from the first issue that it's this, they're living on the remains of like a fallen god who died maybe in that war, who knows. And what's interesting is that the characters in the world, because they live there, they all know where they live, so they don't talk about it. So as the reader, you're trying to figure it out as you go along, because the author doesn't spoon feed you and give you pages of lore about this world that they created. It just emerges during the story naturally, which is, I think, a great example of doing that in a Dungeons and Dragons game, not giving an info dump to your players at the first session to tell them about this really cool, fun, creative world that you've created. Just have them start adventuring and discover the world as they go along, and they'll be much more invested in it than either reading over page after page of stuff that you send them, because let's be honest, they're not going to read it anyway, or listening to you drone on at the first session about how this world is so cool and different from everything that they've ever seen, because chances are it's probably not as different as you think it is. But in any case, I think that there's a lot of things that you can take from this story to help give an idea of how a detective style character could work in a strict fantasy game. There's no technology in this particular world. It's strict fantasy, but it's created this role of a detective and given a reason of why it exists. It's because it's being taken up by these former soldiers who no longer have a war to fight. So I thought that was a really interesting approach to this, and it's given me a lot of ideas for adventures that I run in the game that I run for my daughter and her friends. We're playing, as you guys mostly know, it's BX, 1981 BX, Moldvay Basic Dungeons and Dragons. But I just think that it's a really interesting story. Again, I love the fantasy elements in it. It's mystery, it's fantasy, it's almost like film noir or pulp noir, but again, through a fantasy lens. And what's really cool about it too is that it's a 5-issue series. It's done. It looks like it's not coming back at this point, but you can just buy the trade and read through it. And so you don't have to get bogged down in like a big long story, but each one of the issues is standalone. So it's a procedural, like a Law and Order, or they called it like Fantasy Magnum PI, where every single issue, the mystery is solved at the end of that issue, like the case that she took on. So you could just read one if that's what you wanted to do, but I would highly recommend it. It's got just crazy stuff. It's got fishmen, burglars, and it's got black marketeers and alchemists and, like maps as a way to like convey the information of what the world's like. So I really dig it. I hope that you check it out and let me know if you do. And also let me know about any detective type stories that you've run in your games. All right. And with that, we're going to jump on and talk about the last of the 3 classes that we're talking about, which is going to be from White Dwarf issue number 68. now's a good time to remind you that if you would like to support Daddy Roll the One, a great way to do that is by buying an item from my shop, like a t-shirt, hoodie, mug, poster, or notebook, featuring an exclusive design that you can only find there. I commissioned my artist friend Bill Green to do most of these designs for me. So it's a great way to support the channel. And if you have purchased something from my shop, I'd love to see it in the wild. So feel free to please send me a photo of you wearing a t-shirt or using your mug or whatever it is. And you can send it on, you can hit me up on social media. All that's in the show notes below. Or if you go to the About section of the channel here, you'll see my email address and you can email it to me. So I just love to see if you're enjoying the items. Okay. So really quick, before we jump to White Dwarf number 68, I realized that I mentioned the cover and how much I liked it on issue number 24, but I forgot to mention the artist. So the artist for this is Dave Pether. And he unfortunately passed away in 2021, but he mostly did a lot of actually video game art for the packaging of the video games, but he also did book covers and things like that as well. And again, I just really liked this cover. But let's jump over here to White Dwarf number 68, the one that we're going to be talking about now for our third and final of these three classes. And this cover art, which I love, again, I love the shading, I love the lighting of it. This is done by Brian Williams. Now, Brian unfortunately died back in 2010, but did a lot of role-playing game related works, such as for the Lone Wolf game books, but also did a lot of work for TSR in kind of that mid to late 80s. So if you played during that time, chances are you've seen his artwork before. He did the cover for Drums on Fire Mountain, All That Glitters, Where Chaos Reigns, just a lot of different covers. I think at least 5 or 6 for TSR. So again, I really like his art, and this particular cover I think is really fun. All right, but we're going to be talking about a specific class here, and that's going to be this one, the Artificer, a new character class for AD&D by David Marsh. Now, I couldn't really find too much that David did beyond this, so what I was able to find is that David wrote a few articles in another gaming magazine, also published out of the UK by Pegasus Publishing Limited, called The Gamesman. But other than that, this is kind of, I think, his sort of main claim to fame would be this article, and most specifically, the scenario that's going to be written in this same issue, and we'll talk about that as well. It's called Star of Darkness, and it features an artificer in that adventure. So this is an interesting class. I'm going to increase the page size again so that we can look at what we have here. But it says that they're the herald of the new technological age, which is destined never to reach the AD&D world, which I think is just a really funny way of putting that. But it's their expertise is in all things mechanical. So it says able to turn their hand to making a lock, hinge, box, door, or jewel. They can design new weapons or act as architects. In short, the artificer will try their hand at almost anything and always attempt to further the cause of technology whenever they have the opportunity. So it functionally, mechanically, it's sort of going to be a combination of like a thief magic user with some extra goodies on top. The magic user part is very, very limited. So I do think this would make an interesting adventuring class, although I think it would be a little bit difficult because I think they're slightly underpowered. But it talks about the how they need strength and intelligence of 12 or greater, and then wisdom and dexterity of 15 or greater. So if you're rolling straight down the line, this is going to be very challenging to try to qualify for. But, you know, if you're using one of the other multiple different ways from the Dungeon Master's Guide or Unearthed Arcana, maybe you could pull this off. So they can't be multi-class. They can be any alignment, but they can wear any armor except for plate. They can't wear large helms, and they can only perform their thievish abilities if they're wearing leather armor or less. And it gives you the weapons list there: dagger, short sword, hammer, pick, hand axe, and then any kind of bow. And then it talks about humans, dwarves, half-elves, and gnomes can be artificers. And the dwarf can use the spells because of their pragmatic and partially clerical nature. So once again, you've got this idea that these classes are kind of divine or clerical in nature, which once I don't think that makes sense here. But they say dwarves can do this because dwarves can be NPC clerics. So this is predating Unearthed Arcana, which allowed dwarven cleric player characters. Before that, for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, the only dwarven clerics were all non-player characters. We've talked a little bit about that before. Okay, and then you get your fun level titles here: Apprentice, Journeyman, Technician, Craftsman, Artisan, Engineer, Craftsmaster, Artificer, Master Artificer, and then going on from there, like Master Artificer 10th level. Okay, so this one tops out at 10th. And then, but you can keep going. It's just that you don't show the table beyond that. And then they get these different abilities. So they get Detect Traps and Mechanisms, including pits, shifting walls, spring-loaded traps, and generally. So that's room traps. That's kind of like the thief ability, or I'm sorry, the dwarf abilities. But then they also get the specific thief ability of finding and removing traps, open locks, see irregularity, which is noticing cracks, peepholes, secret doors. So again, that's a kind of dwarven in nature. And then no value, knowledge of the actual market value of gems, jewelry, etc., but not magical properties. And then illusion immunity, which gives them a percentage chance on top of their saving throw to be immune to illusions from being, especially if they're cast by illusionists. And then you get your different abilities up here and how they grow over time. So that like Detect Traps one starts out really, really low, and its highest point, it's only 55%. So that would be a difficult one to use. And then they give racial adjustments for gnomes, elves, and half-elves, but not for dwarves. So dwarves don't, which is odd. You would think dwarves might get bonuses to, say, open locks or something like that, but they don't get any. And then it talks about their spell usage, which they only get up to 3rd level spells, and the spells are all new. They're specific for this class and don't necessarily have a lot of application outside of this kind of class and making different kinds of items. So things like Rust. This enables the caster to make one attack as a rust monster with the same saving throw. That is kind of cool, I guess. It's kind of flavorful. The material component is rust monster's antenna carried in the hand. So you would have to put yourself and your items in harm's way in order to get the material component to cast that spell. But it's kind of cool. But then you have things like lubricate, needs a small blob of grease, causes the area chosen to be covered by a thin film of high quality, non-flammable lubricant. Okay, and then but it doesn't really tell you what that means. Okay, and then a spell like sabotage, which is over here, and it says causes any mechanism not to function such that it needs a number of complete overhauls equal to the level of the caster to work again. The material component is an iron spike. All right, so those are kind of spells that, again, that one's maybe very specific to this class and not necessarily applicable beyond that. Then you've got your special skills, and this is a thing that they get on top of these abilities. So they can pick materials specialties or skill specialties, and then it gives them these little abilities, and they get more as they go up in level. But if they materials like, say, if they pick metal alloys, light metal working skills, and those chosen, but they need to choose the kind of metal, and elements, all substances not covered elsewhere. Wood includes general carpentry skills. Cloth includes tailoring skills. Paper and ink is for making scrolls. So that's very specific. That tells you what you can use it for. The rest of these are, again, left open to DM interpretation and DM rulings. And then your skill specialties, things like weapons. It allows you to design +1 non-magical, non-enchanted weapons. And if you're a master artificer, you can design +2 weapons. Okay. For jewelry, you can work with specialist materials, adding 4% per level to the value of the jewels that you're trying to sell. And then architecture, you can, if you choose mine as your architecture, it gives you dwarven detection abilities, and that which is somehow separate from the other abilities that they've given you already. And then if you choose stronghold and you're using specialist materials, you add 5% per level to the defensive points of your structures. And then you have to refer back to the DMG. So there's some really interesting stuff in here. I think it's kind of a cool class. It's probably the most unique of the three in terms of developing and creating all these new abilities that it gets. The detective one was kind of just leaning into things that were already out there. It had a few new spells. But then you also had the Alchemist, which is probably the least developed. Well, it's not probably. It is the least developed of these three classes, and probably also the least kind of imaginative of the three. So again, and this is early, so I forgot to look at the year. So this, I know it's from August, issue number 68. So it's going to be from the mid to late 80s, I'm assuming here. See if we can find that out. 1985. Okay, so mid summer or mid decade 1985. So this is decades before you're going to see an Artificer class show up and say like Eberron in the 3.5 setting. So if you play 5e, I know that there was a supplement that came out at a certain point that had an Artificer in it. But that really kind of came to the front. And, there had been very similar things throughout, like in the second edition era as well. But it really kind of hit its stride in 3.5 when the Eberron campaign setting was created and Artificer was core to that setting. So, but here you are about 20 years before that. Yeah, because I think Eberron comes out around 2005 or so. So again, you're in 1985, 2 decades before that, and you have an Artificer class here coming out of White Dwarf in England. That's the thing with White Dwarf, is it was doing stuff and it was really pushing the boundaries beyond what you were seeing from standard Dungeons and Dragons and standard Dragon magazine, which were much more sort of the traditional fantasy type of classes. You see these kind of out there classes from White Dwarf that you wouldn't ever see in Dragon magazine. That's kind of why I wanted to talk about it. I do think that these classes are fun and unique and just different and stuff that you don't see. But I would love to hear if you guys want to see me cover more from White Dwarf and just the entire magazines rather than just focusing on the classes. I've noticed that people kind of like my class videos. That's why I focused on these. Also, I'm just personally interested in them. And I really kind of, like I said, probably dig the detective the most. And I've used a lot of ideas from that in the game that I run for my daughter and her friends. So that's going to wrap up this class. However, the video is not over because I do have some exciting things that I want to talk about. One is related to the book that I kickstarted earlier this year, summer. So today is Monday, November 11th. By the way, happy Veterans Day or happy Remembrance Day, depending on where you live, or Armistice Day, if some people, some countries might still call it that. It's also St. Martin's Day or Martinmas, which I celebrate every year on November 11th, same day. And but I'm going to be talking about my book, Alchemy, Explosions, and Inventions in just a second. And also talking about an upcoming giveaway I'm going to be doing in honor of my 100th video that's coming up in 2 more videos from this. So make sure to stay tuned for that. So the adventure in here that features an artifice is called Star of Darkness, and it's by David Marsh also. So he created this as well as the class, the Artificer. And it's an adventure for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 3rd to 4th level. And it's actually pretty fun. It's only 6 pages. As you can see here, it's got this horrendous, White Dwarf was notorious for this. Back in the day, they would put these colored designs over the black text, and it's does not make for very pleasant reading experience. But they did this quite a bit back in the day. They overlaid their text again with those colored designs. But this adventure's got all kinds of stuff. It's got in 6 pages. You get exploration, combat. There's puzzles, moral dilemmas. There's some really neat and creative and unique locations. It's got an assassin, there's a druid, there's different factions. So it's actually quite fun, and perhaps even more so than the Artificer class itself. So the Artificer in this particular case is the villain or the antagonist, whatever you want to call it. And it is a dwarf, which is funny given how in the article about the Artificer, David Marsh says that dwarves make really, really good artificers, and then he uses a dwarf in this case as the Artificer. So that's the adventure that's included here. And again, I mean, I think it was pretty well done given, one, the space constraints of only being 6 pages, but 2, like all the different things that they fit in there and making use of the Artificer class. So definitely check that out if you have a chance. And also, if you've ever run this adventure or played in it, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. So I mentioned a couple things that I wanted to talk about. And the first one is very exciting for me. So those of you who follow the channel probably know that, again, this past summer of 2024, I kickstarted my first role-playing game supplement ever, and that was Alchemy, Explosions, and Inventions. And I've sent the PDFs out to everybody who got the PDF of that, whether you ordered the PDF separately or whether you added it on to getting a POD copy, print on demand. But I finally, after months and months and months of working on trying to figure out how to print these things correctly, got my proofs back for both the soft cover and the limited edition hardcover for my book. So I will this week be sending out links for you to then go order these like at cost. So you're just going to pay for the shipping and the printing, but you're not going to pay for the actual book. So because that was covered as part of your pledge. But this is the hardcover, so this will no longer be available. It's only available to the Kickstarter backers. But I just wanted to show those of you who have been waiting patiently for this what it looks like in person when it's printed out. And then the soft cover with both the parchment paper background and then also the plain white. Some folks prefer to read it this way. These will be available for purchase on Drive-Thru RPG once I've sent them out to all of my backers. So that should be pretty quickly. So I just have to send links out. But I'm super excited about that. So thanks for everyone for their patience. This is my first time doing this, and I just had some issues with setting the print files up correctly. I worked with my designer on this, and he's never experienced any kind of issues before. And all I have to say is the Drive-Thru RPG system, it's pretty antiquated. You can't order digital proofs. The only way to know if your book is going to print correctly is you have to pay for a copy, wait for them to print it and send it to you. And then if you see that there was a mistake, you have to repeat that process. And I had to do that 3 times because of errors that would have been caught had they offered digital proofs. So for those of you who have been doing this for a long time, I mean, I didn't realize how difficult it was to do that. And you have my admiration for having figured it out, because I struggled with it. But I mentioned, like, as an example, I had an alchemy class, and that class is right here. Now, this is one of the misprints where my page spreads didn't align correctly, because that page is actually supposed to be on the right and this page is supposed to be on the left. But I have fixed that by now. I just grabbed this one of my misproofs. But somebody mentioned the picture of the Alchemist, which I thought was very funny. So that's art by Dennis McCarthy, who's kind of famous within the old school gaming community. So that's that. Okay, now the other thing that's going on right now is that coming up, this is my 98th video that I've made starting in February of 2023. And so in 2 videos, that will be obviously my 100th video. So I've decided to do a giveaway. And what I'm going to be giving away is actually these 2 things. So I haven't decided yet how I'm going to be doing the giveaway, like how you'll enter in order to qualify. But these are 2 of my older copies, and they're not in great shape. So I'm just warning people ahead of time. So you can see the box on this is pretty thrashed. The last 2 times I've opened it, pieces of the box have actually fallen off, which is very frustrating. It's just old and brittle, but it has the map. It's got the chits. They are punched, but they're in this baggie here. And the book is complete. So it's got some tape here. But this is the 1979 printing. So this is the second edition. So the first edition of this game was, I've talked about it before in my video on the 1970, the 4 games that came out in 1975, and Boot Who was one of them, but it was pamphlet size. It was the size of one of the original D&D books from the wood grain box set, or the white box, whatever you want to call it. But this is the second printing, or the second edition, again from 1979. So that's one of them. And then the other one is this game. This is 1978. This is the first edition of Gamma World. Once again, this box is thrashed. So I got this from a friend way back in like 1980, probably 83 or 84, at school. Sold it to me for $2. So the box has this janky tape all around it. Okay, there's writing on the inside of the box. So again, this is not a collector's copy. This is a reader copy. If you've never seen this before and want it as a hard copy, you can have this. Again, it's split. Now, the unfortunate thing with this is that there are some pages missing at the back. So as you see here, let's see, no, I think it's before that. Yeah, so see, this is page 46. And then this goes to page 51. So there are pages missing, which are these encounter tables. When I was a kid, I actually wasn't paying attention and I didn't realize that there were pages missing until years later. And then when I did, I actually went through. So as you see, this is it's like D100 encounters, but it starts at 30. I think it's 100. So I went through and actually created encounters to fill in what was missing from here. So, and that's on my blog. So I will post those if anybody is interested in that to kind of fill this in. So unfortunately, this one's not complete. However, it does have, I'm sticking this in here too. This is the original Legion of Gold module by Gary Gygax. So that did not come in this box. It was sold separately, but I'm adding it to this because this book is in such poor shape. It does have a map. However, this map has been drawn on. It's very brittle. As you can see, it's taped. Boy, I almost hate to open it. I mean, you can hear how crackly that is, but it's been drawn on. So again, really, you're not buying this as a play copy. I would hate to say, like the map, definitely no. You could use the rule book because you're not really missing any rules. The only thing you're missing is the counter tables. There's a few write-ups on like the cryptic alliances that aren't in here. But this module's complete and the module's in great shape. So you could 100% play this. And you could play it using the rules from this, even though this has some pages missing. Okay, so those are the two things I'm going to be giving away. I'll be shipping them, and unfortunately, folks, if you live outside the United States, I can't afford the shipping for that. I can afford it in the United States, but I can't afford international shipping. So I will try to come up with some type of prize or giveaway for folks who don't live in the U.S. But if you live in the U.S., I will be giving you information on how to enter into the drawing, which that information will be in that 100th video. I just wanted to get people excited to look forward to that video. So I'll make sure to announce what video it is so you know to watch, but it'll be roughly 2 weeks from now. So that should be the 26th of November. It might be a day after because I'm busy on the 25th that day, so I won't be able to record a video. Okay, so thanks for that. And that is going to wrap up this video. So I really hope that you enjoyed this. It's a little different from some of my other videos, but I wanted to cover some of that history about TSR and Games Workshop and the history of White Dwarf. I love character classes. D&D is a class and level game. So sometimes I think that there's too many classes, but when they're interesting, like the Artificer is something that I think deserves its own class. It's not really something that you can replicate with an existing class. And so I wanted to share that. And I hope that you liked it, and let me know again in the comments below if you enjoyed the video, if you want to see me cover more stuff from White Dwarf, more character classes, or let me know if you've ever used any of those classes. If you are one of the people who actually had those magazines back in the day, and did you ever play an alchemist or more likely a detective or an artificer, and how did it go? What kind of adventures did you have? That kind of thing. I would love to hear about it. So leave all that in the comments below, and then also below in the show notes, you'll see places where you can join me on social media. So Facebook, Instagram, Blue Sky. I've got a lot of new followers on Blue Sky just over the past few weeks. So if you have joined me there and followed me, please stop by and say hi. Let me know who you are, how you found me, and tell me a little bit about yourself. I love chatting. I don't love just, liking people's posts and scrolling and moving on. I like to engage as much as I can. So definitely I would love to see you there. And you'll also find links down below to my blog. And I already talked about my shop, but the other way that you can support my channel is by hitting that little icon that looks like a heart with a $sign in it, if you're able to. and showing me thanks by becoming a super fan. So you can join all these other fine folks, and I would really appreciate it because it really does help me out with how to move forward with the channel and new equipment and things that I can buy. It's like the microphone that I've started using after people said that my sound was a little washed out or muddied or whatever. So ideally, at some point, I do definitely desperately need to upgrade my laptop and my cell phone, which is what I use to record. And so that those are bigger things that are coming down the way. But in the meantime, any little bit helps. So that is going to wrap up this particular video. Thank you so very much for watching. I really appreciate it. And please stay safe, happy gaming, and I'll talk to you next time. And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this particular video. So drinking wise, I actually made this over the weekend, and this is called a Harvest Moon cocktail. So if you can see there, it's got an orange peel. It's supposed to be cut in a circle. My circle is obviously not great, but it's supposed to evoke a harvest moon, the orange peel. So you just, you carve it off with your knife, peel it with a knife. From your orange, you express the oils over the top, and then you drop it into your drink. Now, the actual drink is made of a combination of rye whiskey, Lillet Blanc, and which is like a French aromatized wine, similar to a vermouth in a way. And then, but it's, this one's the Blanc, it's clear. And then it has Calvados or Applejack. So I think I've read that Applejack tends to give it a little bit of a different flavor that some people prefer, but I didn't have Applejack, so I used Calvados, which is like a French apple brandy. And then it has a small measure of green chartreuse. So only a quarter of an ounce, and which is important because I think I've talked about this before, but green chartreuse is getting... It's not that they're making the same amount. The monks in France that make this, they are making the same amount they've always made. It's just that there's way more demand for it now. And so they've basically said, we're not going to increase demand just because cocktail nerds want to get a hold of this spirit. So people started snapping it up. And so it's very, very difficult to get now. And if you can't find it, it's very expensive. My dad bought me a bottle about a year or two ago, and I doled out very sparingly. But I made this delicious cocktail. So Harvest Moon, give it a try. It's just strong and stirred, but that's why it was easy to batch for my guests that I had over the weekend. Okay, so cheers. Thanks for watching. I love that orange on the top. That orange oil really adds some brightness to it. But you get the apple. You definitely get the spiciness from the rye. This is an overproofed rye. And then the Lillet and the green chartreuse kind of play against each other with some really kind of interesting herbal spicy notes to it. So I think that would be a delicious cocktail to have with Thanksgiving dinner. And it's something that, like I said, you can batch it ahead of time. So mix all your ingredients. I'll put the recipe in the show notes, but just mix it all up ahead of time. And if you can't find green chartreuse or it's too expensive, there are substitutes that you can get from other people that are making herbal liqueurs that are in that family. So just Google replacement for green chartreuse. You'll find lots of lists, and then get one of those. Make it ahead of time in a thing, and then you can either stir it as you make it, when you're ready to serve, stir it over ice, and then pour it into, like I said, a glass like this. This is a fancy vintage glass my wife got me. It has some fall leaves on here, but any kind of stemmed cocktail glass will work great. And then peel your orange in kind of that circle and express it over the top. Or if you don't want to take the time to stir it over ice at the time of serving, you can dilute it. You can pre-dilute it. So for each serving of drink, so the serving is about, I think, 3 1/4 ounce. You add about 1/4 to 1/2 ounce of water, and that accounts for the dilution from the stirring, and then put it in your freezer or your fridge, and then that way it's cold and ready to go, and then you can just pour it and serve. So that's another way to go. Okay, so what I was listening to was this Wes Montgomery with the Wynton Kelly Trio. I've talked about Wes before, but he has a very famous album that came out in the 60s called Live at the Half Note. The Half Note was a jazz club. This is Maximum Swing, the unissued 1965 half note recordings. So this is everything else that was recorded during these live sessions that didn't make it onto the official album. And it is fantastic. I love Wes Montgomery. He's a jazz guitarist. Wynton Kelly Trio is Wynton Kelly on piano with Paul Chambers on bass. And I want to say Jimmy Cobb on drums. I just forgot who's on drums. I feel bad about that. Yeah, I was right. Jimmy Cobb. Okay. Now, this one does have Paul Chambers misses a few sessions. So like Ron Carter, who's awesome because he's still with us, who had performed with like Miles Davis and a bunch of famous people, also as a solo, artist in his own right. But he performs bass on a few of these as well. Larry Ridley, Herman Wright. But it's just great music. Wynton Kelly is definitely my favorite jazz guitarist. And I love the music. I love the vibe. He just has a very interesting way of playing. It really just makes me happy. It's a 3-album set. And you also get, because these were live concerts, you get the MC of the evening, like the host of the club, talking about what they're listening to. And I think it was also broadcast live on radio. So he's telling you like what club we're at and who's there, and he introduces the songs. And I forget the name of the host, but he always said at the end of every set, he always says, "Stay beautiful, everyone." So with that, I'm going to say stay beautiful. Thanks so much for watching. Cheers. And I will talk to you next time.